Tonight, a major legal earthquake out of Washington. The United States Supreme Court has ruled against former President Donald Trump's global tariff policy, striking down one of the most aggressive trade actions of his presidency. And this wasn't a narrow technical ruling, it was decisive. 6 justices formed the majority, 3 dissented. The message from the bench was clear: emergency powers have limits. The tariffs in question were imposed under claims of national emergency authority, a move the former president defended as necessary to protect American interests. But now the highest court in the land has determined that justification did not meet the legal threshold required under federal law. This decision could reshape how future presidents use emergency authority, not just on trade, but across executive power. And it lands at a time when global markets, trade partners, and political campaigns are all watching closely. What does this ruling really mean? Who is affected? And what happens next? Because this is not just about tariffs, it's about the boundaries of presidential power in the modern era. And tonight, those boundaries just became clearer.
To understand the weight of this ruling, we need to step back. Trade policy is often handled quietly, negotiated in committees, debated in Congress, adjusted over time. But this case was different. This was about the president invoking emergency authority to impose sweeping tariffs without direct congressional approval. Legal scholars had warned for years that using emergency declarations to justify broad economic actions could stretch executive power beyond its intended scope. Supporters argued it was decisive leadership in a fast-moving global economy. Critics called it an overreach. Now the Supreme Court has weighed in. This is one of the most significant economic rulings to reach the High Court in years. It doesn't just invalidate a tariff schedule, it sets precedent, and precedent shapes future power. The ruling clarifies that emergency declarations cannot serve as a blank check for economic restructuring. The legal standard requires clear evidence of an immediate and extraordinary threat. The majority found that threshold was not sufficiently met. And that finding could echo far beyond trade policy. Because if emergency powers cannot be broadly interpreted for tariffs, what about other areas where presidents have relied on similar authority? This is where the ripple effect begins.
The decision itself was not close. In a 6-3 ruling, the majority concluded that the tariffs imposed under emergency authority exceeded statutory limits. According to the court's opinion, a detailed document spanning over 170 pages, the executive branch did not demonstrate the direct and immediate national threat required to justify the economic action taken. The dissenting justices argued that the president must retain flexibility in responding to evolving international threats, especially in areas tied to national security and cross-border crime. But the majority opinion drew a firm line. Emergency powers, the court wrote, are not a substitute for legislative authority. That line may become one of the most quoted phrases of this term. This ruling reinforces the constitutional balance between branches of government. Congress regulates commerce. The president executes the law. When those boundaries blur, the courts step in. And in this case, they stepped in decisively. The message, urgency does not override statute, and that interpretation now becomes binding law.
At the center of the case were tariffs that imposed a 35% duty on a broad range of Canadian goods and a 10% tariff on certain energy products. The administration justified the move by citing cross-border fentanyl trafficking and national security concerns. The former president argued the measures were necessary leverage, a tool to pressure trading partners into stricter enforcement cooperation. Supporters framed it as strong negotiation strategy. Critics saw it as economic punishment directed at allies. Canada, one of America's largest and closest trading partners, was significantly impacted.
Industries from manufacturing to agriculture faced sudden cost increases. Energy markets adjusted. Supply chains shifted. For American companies importing affected goods, costs rose almost immediately. Some businesses absorbed the increases, others passed them on to consumers. In certain sectors, retaliatory trade responses followed. The legal question was not whether tariffs can be used. They can. The question was whether they could be imposed under emergency authority without additional congressional action. The Supreme Court has now answered that question, and the answer changes the landscape.
Beyond the legal debate lies the economic reality. Tariffs function as taxes on imported goods. When applied at scale, they alter pricing structures, sourcing decisions, and long-term contracts. American importers reported paying millions in additional costs under the tariff structure. Some restructured supply chains entirely. Others renegotiated agreements or shifted sourcing to alternative markets. Canadian exporters reported substantial losses in sectors directly targeted by the tariffs. The integrated North American trade network, built over decades, experienced measurable disruption. Now, with the ruling in place, legal analysts say affected companies may pursue reimbursement claims. That could mean prolonged litigation and financial recalculations. Markets respond to clarity and uncertainty. While the ruling provides legal clarity, it also introduces new variables. Businesses must determine whether alternative policy tools could be introduced in response. Trade policy stability matters to investors. It affects energy pricing, commodity flows, and long-term planning. And when the Supreme Court redraws the boundaries of executive authority, markets take notice.
Politically, the ruling carries significant weight. The former president built much of his economic identity around aggressive trade policy and strong executive action. Tariffs were framed as tools of leverage, instruments of strength. This decision challenges the legal foundation of that strategy. It also underscores the constitutional checks and balances embedded in the American system. The legislative branch had previously signaled discomfort with aspects of the tariff policy. Now, the judicial branch has intervened. For supporters, this may be viewed as judicial constraint on executive flexibility. For critics, it reinforces accountability. Either way, the optics are powerful, the highest court limiting presidential authority. As campaigns and policy debates continue, this ruling will likely be cited as an example of institutional guardrails in action, and it may influence how future administrations approach emergency declarations altogether.
The story does not end with the ruling. Administration officials have indicated that alternative legal avenues may be explored to pursue similar trade objectives that could involve congressional collaboration or revised statutory justification. Legal experts caution that any new action would need to align carefully with the standards clarified by the court. Trade partners are watching closely, so are lawmakers, so are investors. The broader question now emerges. How should emergency powers be defined in a globalized economy where threats are complex and often non-traditional? This ruling narrows one pathway. It does not eliminate executive authority entirely, but it does signal that sweeping economic action requires clear statutory footing. And as global markets adjust and political leaders respond, one principle stands reinforced: no branch operates without limits. Tonight's ruling serves as a reminder that constitutional boundaries remain active and enforceable, and the ripple effects are only beginning.
At its core, this case represents a constitutional stress test. The question was not simply about tariffs, it was about the limits of executive authority. Over time, presidents of both parties have expanded emergency powers in various domains. The judiciary serves as a counterweight when those expansions appear excessive. By ruling against the tariffs, the court reaffirmed the principle that emergencies do not nullify structural safeguards embedded in the Constitution.
Separation of powers exists precisely to prevent concentration of authority. When one branch acts aggressively, another may respond. This dynamic tension defines American governance. The ruling, therefore, becomes more than a policy adjustment. It becomes a statement about institutional resilience. Whether one views the decision as necessary restraint or unnecessary interference, its constitutional significance cannot be understated. Looking ahead, several scenarios emerge. The former president or future administrations could attempt to redesign tariffs using alternative statutory authority. Congress might clarify or revise emergency trade laws to prevent similar disputes. Litigation over financial restitution could take months or years to resolve. Businesses may file claims seeking recovery of funds paid under the invalidated tariffs. Courts will have to determine eligibility, scope, and financial liability. Politically, this ruling may influence campaign narratives. Trade policy has long been central to debates about economic nationalism, globalization, and domestic manufacturing. Candidates may frame the decision either as a defense of constitutional order or as judicial obstruction. In any case, the precedent now shapes the strategic environment for policymakers. Executive action in trade will likely face heightened scrutiny, both legally and politically. Ultimately, this moment reflects a defining feature of American governance: institutional accountability. A president invoked emergency powers to pursue a major economic strategy. The judiciary reviewed that action and concluded it exceeded legal limits. Regardless of political affiliation, the ruling reinforces a foundational idea: no office operates above the law. The durability of democratic systems depends on that principle. The economic and political ripple effects will continue to unfold. Markets will adjust, lawmakers will debate, campaigns will reference this decision, but the constitutional message is already clear. Power in the United States is deliberately divided, deliberately contested, and deliberately constrained. And in this case, that system of checks and balances asserted itself decisively.